Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Should we begin?
Yeah. 1 minute only.
Sure.
Yes, Mahendra, sir.
Thank you.
So with sir's and ma'am's permission, you can begin.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone. Dignitaries, distinguished personalities, scholars, teachers, and respected participants. I, Mahendra Shetty, welcome you all to the 21st webinar on the teaching of English. Let me extend my warm welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Vicky Hale, an esteemed, renowned, and revered professor who is here to deliver a talk on culture, language, and literature. I would also like to welcome our source of inspiration, the Lighthouse, the president of ELT Pune chapter, Dr. Zedin Patil. I cordially and respectfully welcome you, sir, with our warm greetings. I extend a hearty welcome to all our ELT office bearers, chapter members, and participants. I hope you all have been enjoying this series of webinars on the teaching of English. If you have missed any of our webinars, I would like to request you to watch them on our official Facebook page. Don't forget to like our page to never ever miss our programs in the future. I would also like to inform everyone that the ELT Pune chapter, under the guidance of Dr. Zedin Patil, has been relentlessly working for the betterment of society. I would like to highlight that the registration amount we collect is used for charity purposes. I would like to mention that this webinar is being organized by the ELT Pune chapter and powered by MIT ADT University Pune. To tell you more about MIT ADT University, we would like to show a small video. I would like to request Mr. Rahul Kare to kindly share the video. Rahul sir, over to you.
Yeah, I think he has some difficulty. You may go ahead and introduce ELT Pune chapter. I'll talk to him.
Okay. So before I request Dr. Rina Jadhav to introduce ELT Pune chapter, I would like to inform you that the feedback link of this webinar will be shared in the question and answer session. You're requested to write your name correctly. Please do not write it in full block. You're also requested to write your questions in Q&A section, which you can see on your screen. Thank you. May I now request my colleague, Dr. Rina Jadhav, to introduce ELT Pune chapter. Over to you, ma'am.
It seems that she also has a difficulty in joining.
Okay, then I'll go ahead with the introduction of our speaker today. So I feel honored and privileged to introduce today's guest speaker, Professor Vicky Hale, a well-known personality in the field of ELT. Vicky is a virtual English language fellow with the US Department of State, teaching at St. Joseph's College for Women in Visakhapatnam since August 2019. She holds an M.Ed in TESOL and World Language Education from the University of Georgia, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. In addition, she has earned a master's specialist certificate in TESOL and a US Department of State English language programs training of teachers. Vicky taught ESL English as a second language for 5 years in the US before coming to India to adults at several private language schools, where she covered 4 skills work, integrative language teaching, as well as test preparation and pronunciation work. In India, her workshops and webinars for teachers have included integrating 21st century techniques into learning spaces, communicative language teaching, drama and theater in the classrooms, reflective teaching practices and culture, language and literature courses for undergraduates and postgraduate students include communication and presentation skills, overcoming miscommunications, career development, and teaching essentials and methodologies. Previously, Vicky spent 11 years in Russia with her family, 2 of which were teaching English for specific purposes to university students in Russia, and another year as a freelance instructor at high schools in Omsk, Siberia. She believes students need to build on their experiences and appreciate all they have learned and done. She says, one of my jobs is to utilize their own experiences, use it in their classroom, and bring out the best in each student. Multimodalities help to integrate all styles of learners, their backgrounds, and languages. Now, during this age of virtual learning, Vicky hopes for 2 accomplishments. 1, to instill courage and versatility into her students as they continue to learn to communicate, especially cross-culturally, and 2nd, to train, inspire, and empower teachers to bring out the best in every one of their students and to incorporate elements of culture into every subject, especially language and literature. Once again, I take this opportunity to welcome Professor Vicky Hale. May I now request our guest speaker to deliver her talk. Over to you, ma'am.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the participants of English Language Teachers Association of India. And I want to just also thank you for just the open-mindedness of including culture in your teaching of English language and literature. And a very special thank you to Professor Patel for even inspiring me when he didn't know he was inspiring me, because I discovered his paper that I will refer to a couple of times during my talk. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for the encouragement and as I said, the inspiration. So may that inspiration always flow between all of us. So I'm so happy to be here. I wish you a very happy Gandhi Jayanti, and may he continue to inspire all of us. So let's go ahead and begin, and so that we make sure to have time for question and answers. This was, by the way, I'll just give this little disclaimer. This was a 6-week course that I developed the curriculum for. Then I narrowed it down to about an hour and a half. And then I had narrowed it down. Again, I thought it was too much information. And that's what I'm presenting today. So I might have all of this information in my head, and I'll try not to overwhelm you. But I love speaking with teachers. And so please jot down your questions that I'll save time at the end for the question and answers. All right. Culture, language, and literature. I have already done this. This is the paper that Professor Patel wrote. You're probably aware of that. Culture, language, and literature, developing intercultural communicative competence through international, I might have had a typo there, literature. And so there's a couple of times that I will refer to this. It's a fantastic paper if you haven't had the chance to look at it. You can still find it in the English Scholarship Beyond Borders. Okay, I think he needs no introduction here, so I will leave that off and talk to you first about our agenda for today. So the first thing that I want to do is to talk about elements of culture. So the culture wheel and the cultural iceberg that you've probably all seen, but I want to make sure that it is the backdrop for today's message on language and literature with culture, binding them all together. Then we'll go on to the cultural components of language. We'll talk about linguo-cultural items that have expressions and experiential learning. As in my introduction, he mentioned that I'm very much like to bring the students' experiences into the classroom. And then we'll talk about cross-cultural competence as opposed to communicative competence. And finally, we'll end with literature and culture and how they influence one another. So that is our agenda for today, the elements of language and literature that are dependent upon culture, really. And so we need to start with the definition. Let's start with a definition. If I asked you what is culture, if we had time today, I would hear just a variety of words and concepts. It encompasses so many dimensions of life. My favorite definition comes from the Peace Corps website. A system of beliefs, values, and assumptions about life that guide behavior and are shared by a group of people, very important. It includes customs, language, and material artifacts. And these are transmitted from generation to generation, rarely with explicit instructions. We'll talk today just briefly about hidden rules. So the culture wheel shows that it's something that has no beginning and no end, right? It is not something that's linear. It doesn't progress from one stage to another, although it does change. In fact, it is almost multidimensional. It has length and breadth and depth. It is seen and unseen. It is unraveling and yet woven together. And for the moment, though, I want to just stick with two dimensions. And this is probably a diagram that you have seen before, the cultural iceberg, above the surface and below the surface. The visible part of culture, of course, behaviors and practices, clothes, gender, some heroes, even some rituals. But then there are under the surface cultural findings like values, beliefs, perceptions, social status, political views, and even some of those may be apparent. They may manifest themselves in different ways. They demonstrate themselves, and so sometimes we do see them, but they are not always seen. And just by looking at this list, we can imagine the diversity of these items, even within what might be considered one culture, right? The culture of India, even one of the most diverse nations that I have ever lived in, besides the United States, also being very diverse. So it's a great starting point. What I would like to do here is just mention how we can support cultural diversity. What are some of the ways that support this? I'm just going to mention a few. Down at the bottom, you can see my source, and they list a very long list of ways to support cultural diversity. But first of all, you can increase your level of understanding about other cultures by interacting with people outside your own culture. Meaningful relationships may never develop simply due to a lack of understanding. And if you've ever seen Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of a single story, you can also be aware that when you hear one story about somebody or something, it forms a stereotype. And it's not that the stereotypes are necessarily wrong, but they're incomplete. So we want to increase our understanding. We want to advocate, as teachers, we want to advocate for using materials that represent various cultural groups. if you're in class, you want to use those different cultural items on the walls. If you're online, you want to allow people to talk about we did that today in my language center. At St. Joseph's College, we have a language center that every Saturday we have different activities: conversation club, readers theater, discussion and debate, grammar brush-ups and fun learn club, and guest speakers. And even today, when we were talking about food, we talked about food in reference to different cultural groups. So we want to advocate for eliminating bias. And when we're only using one culture, it's biased. So we want to, our textbooks, if you have a close look at your textbooks, you'll see how that there are often biases that we want to overcome and rewrite some of our curriculum. And not just in educational settings. We want to point out cultural insensitivity, bias, or prejudice whenever appropriate. We want to be proactive in listening, accepting, and welcoming people and ideas that are different from our own. In other words, I tell my students, you can learn something from everyone, and that's a great mindset to have. And finally, you can do what you're doing today, taking time to understand the cultural elements of language and literature. So with that in mind, I want to talk about how we can foster growth. All right, be active in fostering growth. What does that mean? So I love the connection between appreciation of cultural diversity and growth. And that brings to mind that word culture. The word culture derives from a French term, which in turn derives from the Latin colere, which means to tend to the earth and grow, or cultivation and nurture, even worship. Sometimes you'll see that Latin word translated as worship. So if culture is the characteristics and the knowledge of a particular group of people, and if it encompasses language and religion, cuisine, social habits, music and arts, then we can go a little step further and define culture as shared patterns of behavior. Interactions and understand that are learned by socialization. So the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition defines culture as shared patterns. So it can be seen as the growth of a group identity promoted by social patterns unique to the group. Let me give you an example of this because it's very evident in the US, because there's a huge population of immigrants starting from the 1800s, but our biggest influx of immigrants was in the early 1900s. But they've changed actually from different areas around the world. And those immigrants carry with them an identity from their home country. And it can be seen in the US, but it does change as they have children who have not been in their home country. I saw a great movie on the airplane. I think it was in May when we had to come back to the US, and it was about an Indian family. And their children were born in the US, but they were carrying on their customs and their traditions. I think the movie was called The Namesake. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a great movie. And you could see certain social patterns that were unique for them. And the movie shows the struggle that it was for the children and for the parents trying to keep those customs alive. So you can see how there is this growth within a group identity, but it's also dynamic. That's that idea of socialization. And we have to keep that in mind when we're beginning to teach language and literature along with culture. So we grow in our learning of language and literature when we incorporate culture into the ideas, concepts, backgrounds, and environments. Okay, there's a setting, there's the conditions, there's the nature of a person, the character, the situation. We have to consider many of those things as we teach language and literature. So, how do we incorporate? I think the process looks something like this. We question, we reflect, we gain insight, which helps us to be more aware of culture all around us. But we can't see everything. That's why we need this process, because we can't see everything. There are so many implicit areas, and there's this thing called hidden rules, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to give you two resources, because obviously we don't have time for all the details about this, but two resources that you can look up. The first is Rita Pearson, and she speaks of the hidden rules of family and also hidden rules in the classroom. And the second is Ruby Payne, and she speaks of hidden rules of poverty, wealth, and class. Let me remind you that hidden rules can be related to race, religion, socioeconomic class. They can be related to many things. So simply put, a hidden rule is a cue. And Rita Pearson says, it lets people know whether or not you belong to the group or not. For example, let's just say me in India, when I first arrived and I saw everybody eating with their hands and not the forks like I was raised with, right? There's a hidden rule that it's okay, and it's the way we do it. But obviously, if I ask for a spoon or a fork, they know I'm not part of that group, right? So if you break the rule, nobody tells you what you did wrong. They just look at you funny. You'll hear things like, in a classroom, you'll hear things, but my mama says, or my parents say, or my family always does this, okay? And it's also found in children growing up in a culture of poverty. This chart here comes from Ruby Payne's website. All right. So because many poor children have been taught the hidden rules of poverty, and that concerning money, we have all of these other areas, but they're taught money is to be spent. You have money, you need to buy what you need, right? But the middle class are taught money is to be managed. The wealthy are taught it's to be conserved and invested. So here we have the hidden rules of the lower class who have not a lot of money, and they go to college or something, and they're not able to understand perhaps this mixture of other classes. So hidden rules are something to become aware of. There are hidden rules in education, family structure, food, social emphasis, driving forces, sorry, I think they made a typo there, driving forces such as survival, right? So it's so interesting to me, and we do need to consider these things because there are hidden rules in intercultural communication. When we're, Sangeeta, did you have a question? Somebody raised their hand. Okay, I'll leave it for two people raise their hands. Should I do those? Should I handle those questions now or later? Two people raise their hand.
Yeah, could we do it towards the end of your session, ma'am?
It's fine with me, yes. So 3 people or 2 or 3 people have their hands raised. If you'll write down that question, don't forget it. And so that way we will keep the flow going and not to make sure that we have time for everything. Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. All right. So I just wanted to mention there exists hidden rules in intercultural communication concerning eye contact, space, tapping of fingers or feet, interrupting, smiling. And this has a lot to do with language. There are hidden rules that we have to learn about in order to operate in different cultures, right? The nonverbal norms of a culture, learning how to allow for silence, learning to look at various interpretations. So we have to ask ourselves sometimes, what are the assumptions that I am making about a situation? You know, sometimes people see the homeless people and they assume that they're homeless by choice, right? That's an assumption. So those are all things, those hidden rules that we have to encounter and think about, especially in literature. So I just want to bring this up. You can look more into that. And we'll move on to two other elements of culture before we talk about language: the big C and the little c, okay? In life, language, and literature. Big C culture, little c culture. So big C culture is the high culture, okay? So who are the great writers, artists, and musicians? What are the lasting, famous works of art, music, and literature? What are the great moments in the culture's history? And iconic works. These are all considered big C cultures. But there are also little c cultures. Pop culture would be considered little c, right? Low culture, things such as the features of daily life, pop culture, social mores, the practices and the traditions. So we have both of these that need to be considered when we're looking at our settings, the people that we're talking to, the environment that we're in. So here's a little trivia quiz for you. Which of the following is not an example of an inherent cultural artifact? The Berlin Wall, the internet, a bald eagle, Big Ben. I'm going to look in the chat. Anyone know? What is not an example of an inherent cultural artifact? No guesses? The internet. All of these others are cultural artifacts, and we're going to talk in just a moment about linguo-cultural artifacts. All right? Okay, so culture in relation to language. I want to keep track of the time. All right. So the Merriam-Webster definition of language: a systematic means of communicating ideas or feelings by the use of conventionalized signs, sounds, gesture, or marks, having understood meanings by a community, right? So if I go into a village and nobody speaks English there and I'm speaking English, I'm not communicating, am I? So when we're teaching language, that's the main thing I want to talk to you about: incorporating culture in the teaching of language. Because culture is very fluid, it's changeable, right? And it's often vague or unfocused. So that sometimes is the case with language, because there are nuances of language in communities. So for teachers and learners of language, listen to these two quotes, if you would, please. Ned Seeley writes, many years ago, 40 years ago, I guess, learning a language in isolation of its cultural roots prevents one from becoming socialized into its contextual use. Knowledge of linguistic structure alone does not carry with it any special insight into the political, social, religious, or economic system. So those things we become quite aware of those when we're teaching about idioms, right? But there are also political and social and religious aspects of a culture that need to be considered when we're learning a language, or the language won't be fully understood. According to Wilga Rivers, in 1981, she said, we must focus on both appropriate content and activities that enable students to assimilate that content. Activities should encourage them to go beyond fact so that they begin to perceive and experience vicariously the deeper levels of the culture of the speakers of the language. And that's why in our language center, we have Conversation Club, because they need to talk about the different aspects of culture and incorporate it into the things that they're talking about, or they won't be able to assimilate into that content. If I'm only teaching English grammar, I am not giving the students a chance to know how it's used in Great Britain, or how it's used in America or Australia or New Zealand or Canada or even India. So culture is so important to incorporate into the teaching of language. There's this fusion of, or intersection, if you want to call it that, of culture and language, all right? So if culture has the ability to acquire new characteristics and forms, we recognize that it's dynamic, right? It's changing. It's like that kaleidoscope that we can move around the little glass pieces, and it forms different pictures, different cultures. So it can take place from one generation to another generation in one form, or from one geographic area to another geographic area. So therefore, culture should be combined with language learning, not isolating the language or the subject. Now, I'm not just talking here about teaching the English language. I'm also talking about teaching science or history or political science or social studies, okay? So we need to incorporate more language into the subjects and the subjects into the language and bring in the culture. Without the cultural component, learning is hindered. Just look at a textbook. Choose a textbook and look at a section and look to see if there are any cultural elements. How could they be better integrated in math class or science or history? We already talked about bias. So especially language classrooms. Language usually is taught in isolation. Grammar, lexicon, but without culture, the performance is impeded. So if I'm only teaching grammar and exercises that don't, now I still teach grammar, and besides being an English language fellow, I am also an English language tutor for corporate business people around the world. I work for an organization called Global ELT. And whenever I am teaching something in grammar, of course, I have exercises that have nothing to do with their business. But then I have to put it into their business culture and use those grammar points in the setting, the situation that they are in. So I want to talk about this element of linguocultural teaching. So in the process of learning, the union of language and information relating to the national culture is called linguocultural. Now, you will sometimes hear linguo and you will sometimes hear lingua, and they both have come from the word tongue. To the best of my knowledge in my research, they're kind of interchangeable, but there is this group of Russian publishers who have talked about linguocultural teaching. And that's another way to teach culture in the language, because they're learning vocabulary, right? But then they sometimes need to learn the background in the meaning of items that have cultural meaning. Let me give you an example. Several examples. Linguocultural items. So this term, linguocultural, is used to denote the part of a language sign which reflects the nationality's specific perception of reality. So it is when you take an item and it has a national meaning that somebody else learning about the language might not know. So I am suggesting that we incorporate those things. This component differs from cross-cultural parts which bear extra linguistic character. For example, the word apteka in Russian means pharmacy, and it denotes an institution where medicine is sold. You go there to buy medicine. But if you go to a drugstore or pharmacy in the United States, you can not only buy medicine, but you can buy chewing gum. You can buy some Coca-Cola. You can buy toilet paper. So this we would call a cross-cultural linguistic character. All right, but the this is my reference here if you want to look more into this very interesting topic. So let me talk about a few lingual cultural items. All right, the first is the driver's license in America. All right, so not only does this give me permission to drive a car in America, but it represents the culture of independence. When you get your driver's license at 16 or 17 in America, you are independent. It represents the culture of law. If you break the laws of driving, you will get a ticket and you can lose your license. It is also representative of the coming of age. So when my son, let's see, 9 years ago, got his driver's license, he came of age. He could do something. Now, he couldn't vote and he couldn't drink, but he could drive. All right. So let's take this item in Russia, the matryoshka. The matryoshka doll, sometimes Americans call it nesting dolls because they fit inside one another. But this represents some different cultural items. All right, the culture of children. Also the culture of folk art. So when I look at this item, it has a cultural component that represents other things. So, and here's one of India. All right, let's just take the Mendi. All right, we can see the culture of art here. We can see that there's the culture of marriage, abundance, and probably more things than I even know are represented by this cultural item. Okay, we have them in every nationality, and unless you're in that nationality, you may not know what else it represents besides being a little doll or being Indian art on the body, right? Or a driver's license. So this is another thing to incorporate into your teaching of language. We're not just teaching vocabulary, we're teaching what they represent in our culture. So you might have heard the term lingua cultural learning, all right? So linguo or lingua mean the tongue, all right? So we can infer that words are expressed, words are understood or not understood. And this is another phrase that was coined, I think back in the 80s, and it's related to experiences, right? So language and culture are complex. These are the principles related to this. Language is experiential. All right, slang and idioms are perfect examples of how these represent experiences in your life. It's connected to culture, hanging out with your peers. I'm not going to play this whole video here, but this is one of the videos when I'm talking about nonverbal communication in my communications class that I show because it's very cultural. Okay. And so let me just show you the beginning of it. No one told you that was gonna be this way. Your job's a joke, bro. And your father, by the way, you got
I don't know. I'm telling you. I can do it.
All right, this is a very fun video, and you can find it on YouTube. And it talks about many different forms of body language, eye contact, tone of your voice, sarcasm. And then it brings in this element of culture that because most students love Friends, first of all, and then they are learning by experiencing and not just by grammar type of thing. So language is a system of meaning, and that system is based on experience. Our understanding of language is largely intuitive, the feeling. And when I get to advanced levels, I talk about the nuances because and connotations, things that are not always taught that are evidence, and it's based on experience. So they have to learn those nuances. So this, yes, 1980s, David Kolb came up with this little chart. You know, because the brain develops networks and intuitive understanding, and so it takes experiences and goes on to reflection, experimentation, abstract conceptualization, and there are really two levels: the 4-stage cycle of learning and 4 separate learning styles. So it takes style and reflection into consideration. So experience is bringing in culture to discuss vocabulary, slang, idioms, many different elements of the English language. Now, I would just want to give you a couple of suggestions. If you need to think of some ideas of how to bring this in, here's one. Consider some cultural artifacts. Just as I showed you in the driver's license of Matryoshka. Identify the cultural markers of these items that make them unique purveyors of cultural information. You can do that for India, you can do that for you can study other countries and look for them. And how might they integrate this kind of culture-specific information into a more general lesson on language? The second idea is to use your own academic setting, your school or your college or your university, and identify the unique cultural icons. I walked around my campus and I saw some different things and some different statues and tried to think about them as cultural icons and determine, were they permanent? Were they ephemeral features of your home culture? Maybe it's a certain campaign that's going on, right? I remember when I first arrived in India in August 2019, we all had to do a pledge to become more physically fit because that was what was happening so there were some cultural icons, but it was more ephemeral to do with this campaign to get more healthy right before the pandemic, right? Who knew? And then they can try to describe how they would best convey these features to a non-English or someone from another culture, how they would explain them to somebody else. So those are a couple exercises that you can use to try to incorporate culture into language. All right, now I do need to mention, because you're English teachers, the differences between communicative competence and cross-cultural competence. Okay, so you all know that communicative competence involves linguistic, sociolinguistic, discourse, and strategy competence, right? When we're teaching our students, we're going to measure how competent they are in communicating by looking at their grammar, by looking at how they speak in different social settings, by looking at their structure. And this last one is very important. Strategy competence is how they repair or correct miscommunications. If they can't do that, if they can't rephrase, if they can't repeat themselves, they're not strategically competent. All right, but under cross-cultural competence, we understand, first of all, the psychological readiness to communicate. Are they interested? Are they motivated? Do they fear this language? We try to understand their level of verbal skills, language material, and most importantly, the necessary amount of socio-cultural knowledge. So the main areas that we measure are cognitive, pragmatic, and motivational. Okay, so when we're seeing if our student is really understanding the language, maybe they're really good at grammar, but how are they in relating to other cultures? We want to look at whether or not they are obtaining information about other cultures. Pragmatically, do they have practical skills that are necessary for intercultural communication? Are they recognizing that there are certain things that we do in different cultures? Motivational terms are connected with the formation of the attitude of the student. So we want to try to get them interested, right? So that they're motivated to learn the language. They're interested in the other cultures, how different people communicate. I, by the way, do not, because there are differences in our Englishes, and I do want to mention that at the Language Center at the end of October, the regional English language officer in New Delhi is going to be speaking at our Language Center on different Englishes, world Englishes. So please, I can send your organization information on that lecture. But anyway, so are they motivated? Are they connecting with the attitude of the different cultures and tolerating and respecting other cultures? These are the things we need to look at. If we see that they're being cynical, we want to work on that, right? Otherwise, they're not cross-culturally competent. They're critical and cynical. Okay, so we know how to measure communicative competence, and we need to work on evaluating cross-cultural competence when teaching a language. And we need to remember the aspect of identity when teaching a language, because speakers can use a language in different ways to express various identities, right? I'm a mother, I use certain words, I'm a teacher to college students, but I'm also a teacher of teachers. So I have different ways of expressing that particular identity, okay? You can read more in Norton's books on identity. How are we doing on time? I should get to literature so that we can have time for questions. Okay, so Dr. Patel wrote in his paper, language orchestrates the culturally conditioned patterns of perception, attitude, and behavior. So that's what I believe he was talking about. We can ask him later. You can direct some of your questions to him. But I think that's what he's talking about. There are identities. We perceive things differently. We need to become cross-culturally competent, not just communicatively competent. And one of the ways I think that we do this is by understanding mindsets. Understanding mindsets. So language helps us with patterns of culture and society's behavior and meanings that we want to express. So in understanding mental models, we can see that we all see the world differently. Our brains delete, let me put that quote up here. Our brains delete, misunderstand, and misinterpret according to these mental models. Sometimes you might hear mental models referred to as perceptual experiences. When we understand and we become aware of these things that affect our perception, then we can understand. I want to give you an example, okay? So mental models, how we understand the world, how we simplify complexity, why we consider some things more relevant than others, and how we reason. Okay, so let me give you an example. Here's one way to think about it. When a botanist looks at a forest, they may focus on the ecosystem. When an environmentalist sees the impact or sees the forest, they see the impact of climate change. When a forestry engineer looks at the forest, they see the state of the tree growth. when a business person looks at a forest, they see the value of the land. Please keep your questions. We're almost going to go there in just a moment. Now, none of these are wrong, but neither are any of them the full scope of the forest, right? So sharing knowledge, learning the basics of other disciplines would lead to a more well-rounded understanding that would allow for better initial decisions about managing the forest. And so when we're looking at culture also, we need to realize that our students have different mental models. Let them express how they're seeing this picture or this environment. Let them, so that they can share with one another. Oh my goodness, I didn't even think of that, they'll say. So, and that has to do with cultural relativity and linguistic relativity. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, obviously, but we need to have this in mind as we move into literature, okay? Cultural relativism is the ability to understand a culture in its own terms, not to make judgments using the standards of our own culture. So important, okay? It's an appreciation of cultural differences. So we've started with this, appreciated, and we want to continue this appreciation through language and literature. Okay, so the understanding these cultural practices are best understood from the standpoint of that particular culture. When I'm in India, and I was only there for a year and a half before I had to leave, no, almost 2 years, but I needed to understand these things through the Indian culture, not through my own. Linguistic relativity is the way people think of the world, which is influenced directly by the language that the people use. So that's why language and culture have to be related, because people use different words to discuss it. They use different words because of how they were raised and what they were taught in school and in the home. People's perceptions are relative to their spoken language. So not every word in every language has a one-to-one exact translation in a different language. So I usually discourage those types of dictionaries, rather using the actual dictionary of the language. Linguistic relativity and cultural relativity. Please understand these when you're teaching language and literature. So there's this roadmap that we have, and we have language over here and literature over, or maybe even another subject besides literature. We have vocabulary, we have grammar, reading and writing. And how are we going to bring them all together? Through culture. Culture is a great tool, actually, not just a backdrop, but a tool to discuss the vocabulary, as we saw in linguocultural, to discuss grammar, and to help with reading and in writing. Now, I'm going to give you one more resource. I won't spend a lot of time on it because you guys can look this up. Well, first, before I give you that tool, I just want everyone to remember the importance of literature. I'm not going to show this video. We don't have time. But let me give you their main points. The benefits of literature: it saves time. It makes you nicer. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Because you see things from other points of view. That's why it makes you nicer. Okay. It's a cure for loneliness. My father, who's 90 years old, I'm here at his home right now. He always says, I'm never bored because I always have a book. It prepares you for failure because you get to read about somebody else going through it, right? We tend to treat literature as a distraction sometimes, or just entertainment. And although it might be those things, in a broader sense, it's like therapy. It's a tool to help us live with wisdom, goodness, and sanity, as the video says. So this is the resource that I want to recommend to you because it was actually written for the Indian classroom. So please look this up. I found it online. You can find it, Creative Techniques of Teaching Literature. The author, here's the website, languageinindia.com. If you can't find it, just email me. I'll help you, or I can send it to you. I think I downloaded it as a PDF. And let me just give you some excerpts from her paper, creative techniques of teaching literature, because literature contains various allusions, customs, manners, mythologies, and other details. We have to refer to various social, political, and religious references. You can't avoid them. You shouldn't avoid them. To understand foreign literature, you have to know its context and background and comprehend the lexical items in that text that carry thematic or content meaning in the piece of literature. At the very minimum, she says, and I agree, the very minimum, be aware of the geography, the history, any social or political aspects or prejudice or traditions. What comes to mind are To Kill a Mockingbird and things like that that you have to be aware of. Excuse me. Begin to see the significance of culture when reading literature. So do look into her paper. Becoming a teacher of English holistically requires seeing culture as an ally to literature. So you need to study culture alongside literature in interdisciplinary ways, okay? Sociology, history, feminism. To better understand literature, look at the historic themes and issues. Interpret texts from the perspectives of gender, religion, all of those topics that we were talking about. Different worldviews, world challenges, humanities, social sciences. Because as we said, words matter, okay? And the meaning behind words, whether they are literary or cultural, make a difference. So I think in Dr. Patel's paper, he talked about literature as a tool and or as the framework. So let me just pull out a few of his concepts, talk about them briefly. Because of the inseparability of language and culture, he says that English teachers can look at lexicon, idioms, grammar, and pragmatic properties of language and literature. And it affords them opportunities to discover different cultural aspects, just as when we look at culture, it helps us understand literature and language. They're the boomerang effect, I call it, okay? If language is investigated within the social context of the community that uses it, then literature must be analyzed and synthesized through the social context of the story. So we forget that sometimes because we get wrapped up in a lot of literary concepts, but we must remember the social context. He said that linguistic resources are drawn upon to express different perceptions of reality. And he gave some examples. You can read that in his paper. They can be understood and circumscribed by bringing it into a theoretical relationship with cultural and societal phenomena. One of the examples I think he gave was Shakespeare's using of the summer night. And summers are different in different countries, right? So it's going to have a different appeal. But one of the people that he quoted, I watched a YouTube video on this guy speaking, and he's won many awards. He's a Nigerian poet and academic. And he said this, listen carefully to this: Western universals crumble in the African worldview. Knowing my audience and deliberately not aiming at British or American cultural tradition, I emphasize content and meaning in my poetry. I write not to develop the English language, but to articulate ideas as clearly as possible. I do not follow English metric patterns. That is not relevant to my message. For me, English is the supra language on top of my own personal language. My writing, though in English, has its roots in Africa, not in England or North America. So well said. So well said. So culture influences literature, and literature influences culture. So it appears in all fiction books. I'm going to wind up now and come to a close so we have time for questions. And we know that every setting has a societal influence. We know that if we're teaching literature. But I want you to think about it vice versa. Okay, the occurrences around a book influence, as do distinct personalities. Think about the book Animal Farm and the substitution of a conflict within a country to a farm. And then, and the characters, of course, are the animals. And also the culture of China is found in the Joy Luck Club. And it also has affected the Chinese mother-daughter relationship. And literature influencing culture of society, I thought of Lord of the Flies. Okay, is it possible that it is what brought about the Hunger Games? Just a question out there. Okay, so there are many concepts that we consider in literature: writing styles, vocabulary, symbolism, metaphors, imagery, personification, all of those concepts. And Patel reminds us that, oh, here's the dark lady of the summer. Okay, so I'm sorry, I was saying that too soon. But anyway, you can see that when we're talking about a summer's day, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Summer in India, Mexico, or England, summers are different, and it's going to have a different appeal to different people. But here's my assertion. I want to say that if we are too quick to apply the concepts of literature without an understanding of the culture, we will miss the transformational, transcendental meaning of the words. So when we're looking at the concepts of literature, whether it's alliteration or metaphor or imagery, we need to look at the culture of the setting and the times in order to really understand the meaning of the words. So my last quote of Professor Patel, because he brought up so many interesting metaphors of coins and dances. Okay, he said the relationship between culture and language is like that between the reverse sides of a coin. The relationship between culture and literature is similar to that of a dance and a dancer. They're inseparable. As Larson Freeman remarks, gone is the notion of a homogenized language, competence, and a monocultural identity. Okay, in its place is the recognition that one speaker's resources overlap with others, but they're also distinctive. In other words, within unity, there is diversity. So I am going to be so bold as to extend that metaphor, that culture, language, and literature are the dance, the dancer, and the music. And I want to give you an example of that combination just for 15 seconds. Because when we have those things working together, we have an audience that's ready to interpret. Look at the music, the dance, and the dancer. The dance, the music, and the dancer, they all go together. And that's how I see culture, language, and literature. Thank you. Now we have time for questions and answers. There's Vandana.
Yeah, hi, hello.
Hello.
Yeah,
Okay.
good evening, all of you. Before we move towards question and answer session, I would quickly like to summarize what Professor Hale talked about in her intellectual presentation with all of us. She started with culture, language, and literature. And in the beginning itself, she gave a lucid definition of culture. And she also raised different questions. And she raised question in the beginning of her presentation. It goes like this: how can you support cultural diversity? So that was a thought-provoking question which she raised for all of us, because we all being English language teachers, we need to think of this when we are dealing with different students. She also pointed out that is we need to pay attention about concept cultural insensitivity, because many a times teachers are insensitive when it comes to culture. So she also pointed out this, and she suggested that we should listen, we should accept, and we should welcome ideas of people, so that we understand culture in a better way. She moved further, and she stated that you need to be very active, so that we can definitely help to grow, and we can understand culture of others. Then she also referred to a movie, The Namesake, and she has recommended all of us to watch it. I'm sure that many of you must have watched it. I haven't, so I'll definitely watch it for sure to understand culture. And then she referred to some experts who talked about culture. To name a few, Rita Pearson as well as Ruby Penn. She referred to these two names. And she differentiated between big culture as well as little culture. So that's really interesting. I was not aware of it. And it was really worth listening to these types of culture, that is big culture and little culture. And she also stated that culture is culture definitely has a relation to language as well as literature. And she gave various examples, like she referred to driving license, she referred to nesting dolls, as well as mehendi. And how we can sense culture through these very simple examples which we see every day. And it was an insight to me, and as well as to other participants as well, that we can definitely look at such simple things from cultural point of view. And she further talked about that literature as well as culture are complex in nature. And experience helps us to understand culture in a better way. She also talked about importance of non-verbal cues when we are interacting with people. Then she talked about cross-cultural competence, wherein she dealt with cognitive goals, pragmatic purpose, as well as motivational references or motivational terms. So if we pay attention towards these, we will definitely be able to understand culture of others in a better way. And towards the end of her session, she talked about cultural relativity as well as linguistic relativity. And she focused on one video which deals with what is literature for. And she referred to 5 important points, which includes literature is for, it saves time, it makes you nicer, and it prepares you for failure. So there were 2 more points, which included that it cures for loneliness, and it's a tool. And she also referred to some literary text, which include Animal Farm as well as A Lord of Lights. And she also referred to Chinese culture with reference to Joy Luck Club and the relation between mother and daughter. And in conclusion, she stated that culture and language, they are reverse sides of a coin. So this is what
That's
she
what
said.
that's what Dr. Patel says. I say culture, language, and literature is the music, the dance, and the dancer.
Okay, so thank you. So I think there are some participants, those who have raised their hands. So
There are a couple in the Q&A. You want me to start with those, Dr. Shirodi?
Yeah, okay. So we'll refer to first questions which are there in question and answer session. The first question is by Wasim, and he states that India being a multilingual country, our learners are equipped with a variety of and at differing levels of cultural experiences. So what mechanisms can we have on account of their cognitive abilities as a result of culturally rich individual practices?
Okay, great question. And yes, I studied a lot about multilingualism in India when I was working on my master's degree, because it's obviously, I think, the most multilingual nation in the world. But anyway, what I want to say about their cultural abilities as a result of this, the best thing that I think you can do is to get them to talk about it, to talk about their experiences, and to do almost like a comparative analysis. Not to say this is right and this is wrong, but this is how it is. That's what I do with language, right? I say, so Americans say it this way, and the Brits say it this way, and the Indians say it this way. None of us are right or wrong. We say it differently. And that's what I think is, if you want to see how they're, working on their cognitive abilities in this get them to talk about it. So how is it different? How would you express that in Hindi? How would you express that in English? And get them to talk about those experiences and the differences in the language. Does that answer that question, Vasim? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for answering the first question. We have a very interesting question from Sabha. She teaches communication skills in a university, and her students are from nearby villages. And she wants to ask a question to you that they all want to become software engineers after completing their degree. So she wants to know that how can she motivate her learners towards multinational companies' corporate culture, and how she can build their confidence and make their attitude positive. So she has asked two questions.
Okay. So the first question is, how can I motivate them? Everybody always asks me, how can I motivate my students? Don't you always get that? You're all teachers, and you're always wondering. All right. So I think the best way to motivate I see a real difference. I'm teaching 2 English for employability classes right now. One are BA students and one are BCom students. And I see a difference in them. And I'm not sure that I'm doing well in motivating one of those groups. But what usually, we need to think of external motivations and internal motivations. So I think that we need to make sure that they understand what's going on in the world today. That if you don't speak English, it's lessening your ability to get a job. That's just the fact. It is not a prejudice. It's not a bias. It's just a fact today. Okay. So, and then I think they have to think about some internal motivations. Who are they doing this for? Many times they're doing it for their parents and they're not doing it for them. And so sometimes that makes it a little bit difficult for them. And so let them talk about their own motivations, and then we can talk about things of the world. Now, also, it's really difficult to go from the classroom to the corporate environment. I teach English to corporate executives who go to different countries. So I don't teach, I tutor. So they're already pretty good at English, but they, and so I actually use I'm going to recommend a book here because I think it's called Business Result. And I love this book. Here, let me just show you. Let's see. Okay, Business Result, it's an Oxford book. And they are different levels. Obviously, I have the advanced here. But what I love is that it's real. First of all, they give examples of real businesses. So they need to start hearing about other businesses. If you don't have this book, get some information from different businesses around the world. Go to their websites and get some information. So you need to start that transition from the classroom to the corporate world. So and then there's a little project. You can give them little projects. Even online, if you're online, you can still have them be in a small group and do a presentation. So practice builds their confidence. And this is a safe place in the classroom to make mistakes. And their attitude, I think, will become more positive when they realize it's okay to make mistakes. And so I tell them to long for something. It's 4 P's: pine for it, long for it, prepare, and practice, and present. So that's what builds confidence. That's what gets rid of stage fear, because they're going to talk to you about stage fear, I'm sure. Okay, next question.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for your valuable insights. We have a question by Raja Bhav. He wants to know, apart from literature, what other sources can be used to sensitize students about culture?
Oh, I have a great idea. So in my 6-week class that I did on culture, language, and literature, one of the most fun things they did was street art. And we have plenty of it in India. And they can look at, so I showed them some examples from some different countries and the meaning, and we looked at some different things. And then they went out and found some street art. And so it's really a great way. So they talk about, what is the artist trying to say? What is the campaign that's going on through this? What do the colors mean? And it's really a great cultural exercise. So besides the 2 that I mentioned in my talk, using your textbook and then walking around your campus and looking for cultural artifacts, street art was another great way to incorporate local culture into the classroom. And they had such fun. They wanted, in fact, but then COVID happened. They wanted to get on a bus and go around and do a street art tour, but we never did get to do that. Maybe when I get back, we could do that. I don't know, this is backwards, right? Somebody's asking me to show my business result. This is the advanced teacher's book, Oxford, Rachel Appleby and Heidi Grant. Now, mine is old. I need to update it, but it's so expensive. Maybe now I'll look, maybe I can, but it's still so relevant, even though it's 10 years old. It's not that old. Most of it is still relevant. But I have to give you one funny story. We were doing one exercise, and in the book, and my student disagreed with me about something about the interpretation of a letter. So I said, oh, I never thought of it that way. So I said, I'll look into that. So I wrote the company, because they told me that these are all real companies, and they answered me. And they said, no, you're right. Sorry, your student's wrong. We were talking about starting restaurants in, it was a whole theme thing. So it's a great book. And so I hope, Mr. Patel, that I answered your question about street art is one idea, and also stories that are of interest to them. That's, if you get them reading things, I used to worry about the things that my son read, the comic books that he read. I used to worry about that, but now he reads everything. And so I think we worry too much. Let them read what they read, so that they read, let them read out loud, and then discuss the different cultural elements. And so a couple of suggestions.
Okay, we'll take one more question. As we are running out of time. The question is by Vidya Nagre, and she teaches in multicultural and multinational classroom. And she wants to know how to deal with cultural taboos in a language class.
I don't see the question, so maybe it was just given to you. Cultural taboos.
It's in the chat box.
It isn't. Oh, it's in the chat instead of the Q&A. Okay. I teach a multicultural, multinational classroom. All right. I think you have to talk about them. I think you have to say that this is a taboo in some countries, so you should be aware of it. That's why awareness is so important. I gave that little question, you know, leading to awareness. Question, reflect, look at the insights that you get, and then become more aware. So that's, I don't think you should ignore them, because then they don't learn and they don't share with others. So I would say, because it also helps in communication to talk about even things that are taboo. So I think you have to talk about them, because we're becoming more multicultural, our global society. So we need to inform our students that what are the taboos in certain cultures. So don't ignore them, discuss them.
Okay, thank you for sharing your ideas on the questions and answers. And now I hand over the platform to Professor Patil to share his views or to share his special comments. Over to you.
Daneshwar sir, just a minute. Thank you so much for handling the question and answer session meticulously. And thank you for that wonderful talk, ma'am. It was indeed very informative. Thank you once again. It is now time for a very important thing. We will now have a virtual group photo. I would like to request all the panelists to switch on their cameras for a beautiful photograph. Thank you.
Be sure to send that to me.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. So I would just like to tell more about MIT ADT University. So I would like to play a small video here. Is my screen visible? Thank you. It's indeed my great privilege to introduce ELT and its Pune chapter on this occasion. The English Language Teachers Association of India, ELT, was founded by the noted educationist, late Professor Padma Shri S. Natarajan. ELT has been bringing teachers of English in India together through national and international level academic activities since its inception. It is the largest association of teachers of English in the country, with nearly 5,000 members who are involved in teaching English from KG to PG. It is an associate of International Association of Teachers of English as Foreign Language, UK, and Teachers of English to speakers of other languages too. It has also been very active in publication through online and printed journals and encourages buddies researchers. ELT completed 50 years in October 2019. In the same year, ELT Pune chapter was inaugurated initially. It was a group of only a few teachers, and now it has crossed a milestone of 250 members. Professor Sridhar Gokhale and Professor Prashant Sinha are the patrons of the chapter, and the chapter has proved to be one of the young and vibrant chapters under the able leadership of Dr. Zidin Patil, the president of ELT Pune chapter. He is strongly supported by Dr. Atul Patil, Vice President, Mr. Rahul Kale, Executive Secretary, Dr. Leena Jadhav, Executive Joint Secretary, Mr. Swapnil Shirsat, Executive Treasurer, and other office bearers. The chapter has been conducting workshops and training programs for students, teachers in collaboration with institutions like ELT Symbiosis, MIT ADT University, Tolani Maritime Institute, eMelta, to name a few, and is living up to its motto, reaching the unreached. During this challenging time of pandemic too, the chapter has conducted several workshops virtually. The revenue generated by the chapter has been spent for the welfare of the society and charity. The office bearers of the chapter have been invited by various national and international organizations to conduct sessions. It is said that alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. I would therefore like to appeal to all to join our hands up and become a member of the Pune chapter and witness transformation as a teacher of English and together reach greater heights. Thank you. I would now like to request Dr. Zidin Patil, the president of ELT Pune chapter, to offer special comments. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Mahendra. And let me at the very outset say a very big thank you to my friend and colleague, Professor Vicky Hale. Vicky, your talk was very illustrative, very useful and relevant, and we'll remember your talk for years to come. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation, and thank you so much for delivering a wonderful talk on a very significant topic. Now, I am grateful to you because you referred to my paper and you made the best use of it. You made the most of it, and I'm grateful to you for that. I suppose Vicky is listening to me. Hello.
Yes, I'm listening. I just had it on mute, so I wasn't disturbing you.
So, Vicky, we are grateful to you because your talk was very useful, very relevant, very pertinent, and illustrative. And we'll remember your talk for many, many years to come. And your talk has been one of the best talks that we have ever heard. Thank you so much for that. And I'm personally indebted to you because you referred to my paper, and you referring to my paper is a kind of a certificate for me, right? Because you are a native speaker and a competent speaker, and therefore I consider it my honor and my privilege that you refer to my paper and made the most of it, made the best of it. You said almost everything significant as far as culture and language and literature are concerned. However, since my team wants me to offer a few comments, I'd like to do that. And I would like to present my 5 to 6 little ideas in the form of little nuggets. Nugget number 1, when we talk about a particular culture, and that culture may be Japanese culture, Vietnamese culture, American culture, or any culture for that matter, we need to be a little cautious. We need to be a little careful. Now, I remember something that happened several years ago. There were 2 people and they were traveling by train, and they saw some sheep grazing on a lawn. And one of the two participants, one of the two co-travelers said to the other, look at those sheep. Those sheep have been shown. And the other participant said, yes, it seems to me that the sheep have been shown on this side. Now, this is a very, very interesting piece of conversation that happens between the two travelers who are traveling by train. Now, when we talk about a culture, we need to be very careful because, let me give you my personal example. I was in Vietnam for 3.5 years, and I spent 3 years in Japan, and I could understand only a bit of the cultures. And I could see only the tip of the iceberg. Vietnamese culture, Japanese culture, like any other culture for that matter, is like a huge iceberg. And during my stints, 3-year and 3.5 stints in Vietnam and Japan, I could see only the tip of the iceberg. So the first thing that I would like to note here is that we need to be very careful when we talk about different cultures. Cultures are huge, they are mammoths. And as Vicky rightly pointed out, there is visible culture, there is invisible culture. Culture is like gravity, and we don't realize the force of this gravity, force of our culture, unless we jump up in the air. It pulls us down. So culture is like gravity, culture is like our shadow. It follows that wherever and whenever we go to wherever we want to go. That's number one. Number two, what is acceptable in one context, in one culture, may not be acceptable in another context and another culture. And I'll give you the example of coaxing. Vicky, I think you know that in our culture, in Indian culture, when a host and a guest come together, the host is supposed to coax. The guest may be done, most of the times the guest is done, but the host thinks that the guest has not eaten anything, and therefore, please have something more, please have a second helping, please have another helping. So the host goes on coaxing. This is okay in Indian culture. It may not be okay in American culture. I don't think you coax to that extent in America. That's number two. Number three, like phenomena like turn taking are also culture bound, culture specific. And I've identified 4 different types of turn-taking phenomena. One speaker speaks and stops, and immediately after that, the second speaker starts, right? So the second speaker's turn is hooked onto the first speaker's turn. There is an absolutely perfect match between what the first speaker says and what the second speaker says. That's number one. Number two, the first speaker says something, and there is some gap, there is some silence, and the second speaker starts talking. This culture is Japanese culture. Japanese culture is considered to be culture of silence. They are not talkative people. They don't talk a lot, right?
In India, read the air. The Japanese say, read the air.
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm. So, what is acceptable in one culture may not be acceptable in another culture. Like, for example, somebody asked you a question about taboos. I'll give you a couple of examples. I was in Vietnam, and I found it very interesting to note that 3 people never took a photograph together, either 2 or 4 or more than 4. Why? Because in Vietnamese culture, people believe that the person in the center, the person in the middle, will die soon, right? That's why they take picture of 2 people or 4 people or more than that, right? So this is interesting. So superstitions are also culture specific, culture bound. And in Japan, they don't bring 4 gifts. They bring 1 gift or 2 gifts or 3 gifts or 5 gifts. They don't bring 4 gifts because the word for 4 in Japanese language is she. And the word for die is also she. So the meanings are very similar and the sounds are very similar. She means die, to die, and she also means number 4. So they don't carry 4 gifts because the word for is the same as the word for the verb die. So taboos are also culture bound, culture specific, right? So, I don't have to elaborate on the different types of turn taking that we notice across the globe. I just gave you a couple of examples. And number three, the culture of the hearer and the culture of the reader influences the interpretation. It's not just the encoding that is affected by the culture. The author writes something, the speaker says something, and what is written by the author, what is said by the speaker, are conditioned by the cultures of the speaker and the author. That's one side. But the culture of the reader and the culture of the listener also affects the interpretive process. And we need to keep that in mind. Like, for example, let's take Henrik Ibsen's Doll's House. It's a very popular play, Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. Now, in this particular play, there is a woman who revolts against the husband because she wants freedom. Now, if you ask some American or some English reader to interpret this play, the interpretation will be of one type. You give the same play to an Afghan, right? To an Afghan reader, an orthodox, traditional, conditioned, Afghan reader, his interpretation will be different because in Afghanistan, you know what's happening there. Women are not given freedom. So interpretation of the same play in Afghanistan will differ from interpretation of the same play in America or in India. That is one thing that we need to keep in mind, right? So culture influences the speaker, culture influences the writer, culture influences the listener, culture influences the reader, and we should keep all these things in mind when we talk about cultures. In fact, one last thing I would like to make a note of here is that culture reveals itself not only in general conversation, everyday conversation, but also in specialized interactions such as negotiation. Like, for example, negotiations in America are different from negotiations in Japan. A Japanese contract leaves many things ambiguous, many things vague. So vagueness, ambiguity are qualities of a contract that is signed in Japan. But on the other hand, contracts in America, I know, and you will bear with me, that contracts in America are very clear, very explicit. There is nothing that is ambiguous. There is nothing that is vague. So these are some of the views that I wanted to share with you. In fact, you considered almost everything that was significant. And I was a bit hesitant to offer my comments because my comments are not very fresh. They are sort of rewordings of the things that you said during your talk. So thank you once again, Vicky, for this particular webinar. And we are all grateful to you. And I'm sure our participants and our office bearers have all benefited from your talk, immensely benefited from your talk. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you
Back
for
to
the
you, Mahendra.
privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable inputs, sir. It is always a pleasure listening to you. Now, I would like to take a very few moments to propose vote of thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, this session will be incomplete if I don't thank all of you. Therefore, on behalf of ELT Pune chapter, I extend my sincere gratitude to our guest speaker, Professor Vicky Hale, for this significant deliverance on culture, language, and literature. I'm sure our viewers have learned many things from your talk. It was indeed our pleasure having you here. Thank you, ma'am. I cannot thank enough Dr. Zitin Patil, our beloved president, for making this opportunity available to all of us. It is because of him we always get to listen to such renowned experts. We also extend our gratitude to all the participants and ELT Pune chapter members from India and abroad for their active participation. We are truly fortunate that we could reach out to all of you. I would also like to thank Dr. Dhaneshwar, Mr. Dr. Atul Patil, and all our office bearers for their kind support Thank you, everyone. And last but not least, all the members of ELT Pune chapter and all the viewers of this webinar for making our efforts more fruitful and meaningful. Thank you for your gracious participation and presence for this webinar. Well, I believe that that's about everything, ladies and gentlemen. We have come to the end of